It was one of those warm afternoons that made the city feel alive. The mall parking lot was full, and people moved in and out of the stores carrying shopping bags and chatting about weekend plans. Inside the large shopping center, the sound of music, laughter, and distant conversations blended together. Among the many shoppers walking through the bright corridors was a woman who looked calm and confident, yet seemed to prefer keeping to herself. Her name was Alicia Carter. She was 34 years old and worked as a police detective. Today, however, she wasn't wearing her badge or her uniform. She wasn't at work. She was just another person enjoying her day off, dressed in jeans, sneakers, and a simple white shirt. Alicia had spent the whole week on duty, dealing with long hours, tense moments, and paperwork that never seemed to end. So this day off meant a lot to her. All she wanted was a quiet afternoon to buy a few things and enjoy a small break from responsibility. She had come to the mall to find a birthday gift for her niece. The little girl was turning 8, and Alicia had promised to bring her something special. As she walked through the mall, she looked into different stores, checking for toys, clothes, and small accessories. Eventually, she walked into a mid-sized clothing store that had a big sign offering discounts. The store wasn't too crowded, but it was busy enough to feel alive. Alicia greeted the store clerk at the entrance with a polite smile. The clerk, a young woman in her 20s, smiled back but gave only a quick nod. Alicia didn't think much of it. She moved toward the children's section, looking at shirts and dresses. She carefully picked up a few items, checking the fabric and sizes. She liked taking her time. She wanted her niece to love whatever she chose. As she moved through the aisles, Alicia carried a reusable shopping tote that she always brought with her. She preferred it over plastic bags because it was strong and better for the environment. She often used it when she shopped off-duty. Inside, she already had a few small things from other stores: a notebook, a water bottle, and a small candle she had bought earlier. After about 20 minutes of browsing, she found a cute pink dress that looked perfect. She smiled to herself and carried it along with a small pair of shoes. As she walked toward the fitting area, she noticed the same store clerk looking her way again. The clerk quickly looked away when Alicia met her eyes. Alicia didn't think much of it at first. She was used to being aware of people's body language. It came naturally from years of working in law enforcement. But today she didn't want to overthink. She just wanted to enjoy her shopping. Still, something about the clerk's behavior didn't sit right with her. The young woman whispered something to another employee who glanced toward Alicia too. It wasn't loud enough to hear, but Alicia noticed. She had been in enough situations on duty to recognize when she was being watched. Alicia decided to ignore it and continued to look around. After all, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She placed the small shoes and dress inside her tote bag for a moment, while she freed her hands to check her phone and wallet. She had every intention of paying before leaving, but to someone who didn't know, it might have looked suspicious and as if she were hiding items. The clerk, who had already been uneasy, saw that motion from the counter. Her face tensed. She quickly stepped aside and spoke to her manager, who frowned slightly and looked toward Alicia. The manager, instead of approaching her directly, decided to contact mall security just to check things out. Alicia continued browsing without any clue that she was being watched more closely now. She stopped by a display near the register and found a small bracelet that would go perfectly with the dress. She smiled softly and picked it up. She was about to pay when 2 men wearing dark uniforms, mall security guards, entered the store. One of them spoke to the clerk quietly, and the other stood near the entrance, glancing around. Alicia noticed their presence and instantly became more alert. Her instincts as a police officer kicked in. She didn't move suddenly or say anything. She simply watched from the corner of her eye, pretending to still browse. After a short moment, one of the security guards approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely but firmly. "Can we speak to you for a moment?" Alicia turned, slightly surprised. "Sure," she said calmly. "Is something wrong?" The guard looked at her tote bag. "One of the store employees thought you might have placed some items inside your bag without paying." Alicia blinked, trying to stay patient. "Yes, I did put some items in my bag," she said in a measured voice. "I always do that while shopping, but I'm still shopping. I haven't even gone to the counter yet." The guard nodded but didn't seem fully convinced. "Would you mind showing us the contents of your bag?" Alicia sighed quietly. She didn't want to make a scene, especially not here. surrounded by people who had started to turn their heads. But she also didn't want to be treated unfairly. "Of course," she said, keeping her tone steady. She slowly unzipped the bag and showed the items inside: her candle, her notebook, her water bottle, and the 2 clothing items she planned to pay for. The guard looked inside, then at the clerk, who was watching from the counter. The clerk shrugged, as if unsure now. The situation could have ended there, but the guard hesitated. "I understand," Alicia said, keeping her composure, "but I haven't left the store and I plan to pay. You can check the cameras if you'd like." The guard hesitated again, then nodded. "All right, ma'am. Thank you. Sorry for the misunderstanding." Alicia nodded and turned toward the counter to finish paying. The tension began to fade, but it didn't end there. The store clerk, still uneasy, called the local police, saying a suspicious person had been caught but was acting calm and might be hiding something. While Alicia was paying for the items, she noticed the security guards speaking on their radios again. She could hear bits and pieces, phrases like "officers on the way" and "possible shoplifting." She felt frustration rising inside her. She had done nothing wrong, yet she could feel the weight of assumptions around her. About 5 minutes later, 2 uniformed police officers entered the store. Alicia immediately recognized them by their posture and the way they scanned the room. She watched as one of them, a tall man with a serious face, approached the clerk, who quickly explained her version of events. The officer nodded, then turned toward Alicia. "Ma'am," he said as he walked over, "could we talk for a moment?" Alicia turned, holding her shopping bag. "Sure," she said again, keeping her tone calm, though she could feel the air growing tense. The officer looked down at the bag and then back at her. "We got a call about a possible shoplifting incident. Do you mind showing us what's in your bag?" Alicia sighed quietly. "I already did," she replied. "The store security checked it. I paid for everything. You can ask the cashier." The cashier, now visibly uncomfortable, nodded. "She just paid," the young woman said softly, but the officer didn't seem satisfied. He looked back at Alicia. "Ma'am, I'll still need to see a receipt," he said. Alicia opened the small bag from the register and handed over the receipt. The officer looked at it, then at her again. "All right," he said slowly. "And what were you doing before that?" "I was shopping," she said, her voice even. "I put the items in my tote while I looked around."
"I always do that."
"I wasn't trying to hide anything." The second officer joined in, his expression more skeptical. "You know, people say that all the time," he said, crossing his arms. Alicia met his eyes calmly. "I understand," she said, "but I'm not one of those people." The first officer tilted his head slightly, as if trying to read her. "Do you have any identification with you?" "Yes," Alicia said, reaching slowly into her bag. "I'm going to take out my wallet." "Go ahead," the first officer said, his tone cautious. She carefully opened her bag and pulled out her wallet. As she did, something small and shiny fell to the floor, her badge holder. It slid a few inches before stopping near the officer's shoe. The officer looked down at it, confused. Alicia immediately said, "That's my badge. I'm a detective with the department." For a second, there was silence. The officer frowned and picked it up. He looked at the badge, then back at her. "This is yours?" he asked. "Yes," Alicia replied evenly. "You can call my precinct to confirm." The second officer gave her a doubtful look. "We get fake badges all the time," he said flatly. Alicia felt a spark of disbelief. "You think I'm carrying a fake police badge while shopping?" she asked, her voice still calm but edged with frustration. "Just asking questions," he said. At this point, other shoppers had stopped and were watching. Some whispered to each other, pulling out their phones. Alicia could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She had been in tense situations before. Interrogations, crime scenes, even dangerous arrests. But this was different. This time she wasn't being treated like an officer or even a person with dignity. She was being treated like a suspect. The first officer radioed for confirmation, but instead of calling her precinct directly, he requested a record check based on her name. It would take time. Meanwhile, he asked her to step aside, just for clarity. Alicia complied, standing quietly near the front of the store. She could hear whispers from the crowd. A child tugged at their mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, is that lady going to jail?" The woman shushed the child, but Alicia heard it. Her chest tightened slightly. The store manager finally approached, looking nervous. "Officers, I think this is all a misunderstanding," he said quickly. She paid for her items. I checked myself. The taller officer turned to him. We just need to confirm her identity, he said, not unkindly but with a tone that carried authority. The manager nodded, glancing apologetically at Alicia. I'm so sorry about this, he whispered. Alicia gave a faint smile. It's fine, she said, though it wasn't. She stood quietly, holding her bag, trying to keep her posture straight. Inside, her thoughts were racing. She wondered how quickly things could turn, how easily assumptions could shift a simple shopping trip into an embarrassing scene. After a few long minutes, the officer's radio crackled. He stepped aside to listen. When he came back, his tone had changed. Detective Carter? He asked, his voice uncertain now. Alicia nodded. Yes, she said. The officer cleared his throat. It checks out, he said quietly. Sorry for the confusion, ma'am. The words didn't make the moment any easier. Alicia nodded slowly, took her bag and said a thank you. I'd like to leave now. The officer stepped back, letting her pass. The crowd parted, watching silently as she walked out of the store and down the mall corridor. Her face stayed calm, but inside she felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. She didn't want to cause a scene or lecture anyone, but the truth stung. She had spent her life serving the same system that had just humiliated her. As she reached the exit, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The sunlight outside felt warm on her face. She reminded herself to stay grounded, to not let anger take over. But she knew something deeper had been revealed that day. Something about perception, about trust, and about how easily people could be judged before being known. She unlocked her car, placed the shopping bag inside, and sat quietly for a moment. The air in the car felt heavy. Her badge sat on the passenger seat, gleaming faintly in the light. She stared at it for a while, thinking about what had just happened. She had faced many tough days in her career, but this one cut differently. It wasn't just about being mistaken for a thief. It was about being unseen for who she really was. As she started the car and drove away, the mall faded in the rearview mirror. Alicia didn't know yet that what had just happened would soon become much bigger than an uncomfortable misunderstanding. Someone in that crowd had filmed the entire thing, and before long the video would make its way online. But for now she didn't know that. All she knew was the ache of being treated like a stranger in her own uniformless skin. And as she drove through the quiet streets, still in her plain clothes, she told herself one thing. She wouldn't stay silent about this forever. Alicia didn't sleep well that night. Even though she tried to tell herself to let it go, her mind kept returning to the moment in the store when those officers stood over her, questioning her like she was a criminal. She could still hear the whispers from strangers, the way everyone stared at her, and how powerless she felt even though she was a police officer herself. She had dealt with difficult people before. She had been yelled at, insulted, even threatened during her work, but that day was different. This time she wasn't on duty and she wasn't in control. She was simply a woman trying to shop, and yet she was treated like she didn't belong. The next morning she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The sun was streaming through the window, but she didn't really notice. She just sat there staring at the coffee, thinking. Her phone buzzed on the counter. When she checked it, she saw a message from her colleague, Officer Raymond, who worked in her precinct. "Hey, are you okay?" It read. She frowned, confused. She hadn't told anyone about what happened yet. She typed back, "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" A few seconds later, another message came through. "There's a video going around online. Is that you at the mall?" Alicia froze. Her stomach sank. She quickly opened her social media feed and started scrolling. It didn't take long to find it. Someone had posted a video titled, "Woman wrongfully accused of shoplifting, turns out she's a cop." She tapped it with shaky fingers. The video started with her standing in the clothing store, holding her bag while two officers questioned her. The person filming had caught nearly everything. The doubt in the officer's tone, her calm explanations, the moment her badge fell, and the awkward silence when they realized who she was. The video wasn't long, but it was powerful. The comments were already flooding in. Some people defended her, saying she handled herself with grace and patience. Others expressed anger, calling the situation another example of unfair treatment. Within hours, the video had thousands of views. By noon, local news outlets were already sharing it with headlines like, "Off-duty detective mistaken for shoplifter," and "Police department faces." Backlash over viral mall incident. Alicia put her phone down and rubbed her temples. She didn't want attention. She didn't post about it or seek sympathy. She just wanted peace. But now it was out of her hands. That afternoon, her phone rang again. This time it was her supervisor, Captain Reeves. Detective Carter. His steady voice came through the line. "I assume you've seen the video." "Yes, sir," Alicia said quietly. "We need you to come in. The chief wants to talk." Alicia agreed, hung up, and sat for a moment longer before getting ready. She didn't want to relive it all, but she knew this conversation was coming whether she liked it or not. When she arrived at the precinct, everyone seemed to already know. Some of her co-workers gave her sympathetic looks. Others avoided eye contact as if unsure what to say. In the conference room, Captain Reeves and the police chief were waiting. Both looked serious but not angry. "Have a seat," the chief said. Alicia sat down. The chief leaned forward. "We saw the footage. First, I want to say I'm sorry you went through that. It shouldn't have happened." "Thank you," Alicia said softly. He continued. "This has caused quite a stir. The media's been calling, asking for statements. The department where those officers work has already launched an internal review." Alicia nodded but didn't speak. She didn't want to say anything out of frustration. The chief studied her face. "Would you be willing to give a statement yourself? The public's looking for your side of the story." Alicia shook her head. "Not right now," she said. "I'm still processing it. I don't want to say anything emotional." "That's fair," the captain said gently. "But I do think your voice could help people understand what happened." Alicia looked down at her hands. "Maybe later," she said quietly. When she left the room, she walked through the hall feeling the weight of everyone's eyes again. Not judgmental this time, but curious, concerned, even proud. A few fellow detectives patted her shoulder as she passed, telling her to hang in there. That evening, she went home and sat on her couch, scrolling through the endless stream of messages and comments. She had hundreds of notifications, friends checking in, journalists requesting interviews, and strangers thanking her for handling the situation so calmly. Alicia didn't reply to most of them. She wasn't sure what to say. The truth was she didn't feel calm inside. She felt tired, drained, and disappointed, not just in the officers who stopped her, but in the system she had devoted her life to. A few days later, she got another call, this time from the public affairs officer at her department. "Detective, the chiefs decided to hold a press briefing about the mall incident," the voice on the other end said. "We'd like you to attend, but only if you're comfortable." Alicia hesitated. "I don't want this to be about me," she said. "It's already about you," the officer said kindly. "But it could also be about awareness. You could help start an important conversation." Alicia thought about it that night. She replayed the moment when she was handcuffed in the store, when the crowd watched, and when she felt small and voiceless. She thought about all the times she had seen people treated unfairly, and how she had always told herself she could make a difference from the inside. Maybe this was her chance to do that. So the next morning, she agreed to attend the press briefing. When she arrived, cameras were already set up. Reporters filled the small room, microphones in hand, ready to ask questions. The chief started first, addressing the issue calmly, acknowledging the mistake and promising steps to prevent similar incidents in the future. Then he introduced Alicia. She took a slow breath and stepped up to the podium. The cameras clicked. "Good morning," she began. "I want to start by saying that this isn't about me being a police officer. It's about how we see and treat people in general. What happened to me could happen to anyone. I was calm because I've been trained to be calm, but many people don't get that chance." She paused, letting her words sink in. The officers involved made an assumption. They saw someone who fit a certain image in their mind, and they reacted before they had facts. I'm not angry at them, but I do think it's time we look closely at how we make judgments about others, even when we wear a badge. Her voice was steady, but emotional. "I still believe in law enforcement. I still believe in justice. But belief doesn't mean ignoring flaws. It means working to fix them." The room was silent except for the soft clicks of cameras. When she finished, the chief thanked her, and reporters immediately began asking questions. She answered a few, always calm, always thoughtful, and then stepped away from the podium. Afterward, several officers approached her privately. Some thanked her for speaking. Others admitted they had been forced to rethink how they looked at people in public. One younger officer said quietly, "Detective Carter, I watched that video. I didn't realize how bad it must feel until I saw your face in that moment. It made me think." Alicia smiled gently. "That's all I want," she said. "For people to think." But not everyone took it that way. Online, while many supported her, a few voices criticized her for embarrassing the department by speaking publicly. Some said she was playing the victim. She read a few of those comments and then stopped. She had seen enough negativity in her life to know when not to feed it. Over the next week, the story kept spreading. News outlets interviewed experts about racial bias and policing. Community groups invited Alicia to speak at forums. Even some schools reached out, asking her to talk to students about fairness and respect. At first, she turned down most requests. She didn't want to be known just for this incident. But when she visited her niece's birthday party, the same niece she had gone shopping for that day, something shifted in her heart. Her niece ran up to her, hugging her tightly. "Auntie, I saw you on TV," the little girl said excitedly. "Mommy said you're brave." Alicia smiled softly. "I don't know about brave," she said. "I just told the truth." Her niece looked up at her. "Are you sad?" Alicia paused, then knelt down so they were eye level. "I was sad," she said honestly, "but I'm okay now." Her niece nodded, satisfied with that answer, and ran off to play. Alicia watched her for a while, feeling something lighten inside her. Maybe sharing her story wasn't about attention. Maybe it was about planting a seed, so that someday, her niece wouldn't have to go through the same thing. That night, she decided she would attend one of the community events after all. A week later, Alicia stood in front of a small group at a local community center. The audience was made up of people from all backgrounds: students, parents, a few retired officers, and even the mall store manager who had called the police that day. When she saw him, Alicia took a slow breath but smiled politely. She knew holding on to anger wouldn't change anything. She spoke for nearly an hour, not from a script but from her heart. She told them what it felt like to be on both sides of the badge, to protect others yet still face bias. She talked about empathy, about listening, about slowing down before judging. After the event, people lined up to thank her. Some shared their own stories, small moments of feeling unseen or misunderstood. The store manager came last. "I wanted to say sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for things to go the way they did. I was trying to follow procedure." "I understand," Alicia said gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." He nodded, visibly emotional. "I've learned a lot from this," he said. As Alicia drove home that night, she felt something she hadn't felt since the incident: peace. She knew the situation was far from over, that discussions would continue and opinions would differ, but she also knew she had turned something painful into something meaningful. Still, the department where the two officers worked was facing growing criticism. Reporters kept pressing for updates, and both officers had been placed on temporary leave pending review. Alicia didn't wish them harm, but she hoped the process would make them reflect the way she had. One evening, she received a handwritten letter. It had no return address. Inside it simply said, "Detective Carter, I was one of the officers at the mall that day. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know sorry isn't enough, but I've been thinking about what happened every day. I realized I judged you before I even listened. I'm learning from this, and I hope to be better." Alicia read the letter twice. There was no name, but she knew who it was from. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her notebook. It didn't erase what had happened, but it reminded her that change, even small, was possible. Over the following weeks, she noticed something new at the precinct: conversations. Officers were talking openly about bias, about assumptions, about patience. For the first time, she felt like the lesson she hadn't wanted to teach had actually reached people. Every now and then, strangers would still recognize her in public. Some thanked her, some asked for photos, but she always stayed humble. Inside, she remained the same person: calm, thoughtful, and dedicated. But something in her outlook had shifted forever. She had always believed that wearing a badge meant serving justice. Now she understood it also meant seeing people, truly seeing them, before deciding who they were. And though she didn't plan it, her quiet strength had become a mirror, reflecting not just her own courage but the flaws and hope within the system she served. That was how Alicia began to move forward, One conversation, one honest moment, one step at a time, and somewhere in the background, the world kept talking, watching, learning, because sometimes one person's story is enough to start a change far bigger than they ever imagined. Alicia's days slowly began to feel normal again, or at least that's what she tried to tell herself. The media attention had started to quiet down, and her name wasn't appearing in the headlines as often. The story had faded from the public eye, just like most news stories eventually do. But for Alicia, the memory hadn't faded. Even when she went back to work, she could feel that something inside her had changed. Before the incident, she had always believed she could handle anything. She was calm, confident, and proud of her job. But now, every time she walked into a store or even just stopped at a coffee shop, she caught herself looking over her shoulder. Not out of fear, but from a quiet awareness that people might still be watching her, judging her, misunderstanding her. Her colleagues tried to treat her the same, but she noticed small changes. Some spoke to her more softly, almost too carefully, as if she might break. Others were overly supportive, constantly reminding her how strong she was. She appreciated their kindness, but part of her missed being treated like just another detective doing her job. One morning, Alicia sat at her desk reviewing a new case file when Captain Reeves walked in. He placed a folder on her desk and said, "This one's yours. I know you've been through a lot, but I think you'll want to handle this personally." She glanced up at him, curious. "What's the case?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's about a complaint filed at the department where those two officers work. It's a training review. A community oversight committee is getting involved. They asked for someone with experience and perspective." Alicia understood what he meant immediately. She was being asked to help evaluate the very department that had embarrassed her in front of the whole city. "Are you sure you want me for this?" she asked. The captain nodded. "You're the best fit. You know how to stay objective, and you have more patience than most people I know. You don't have to take it, but I thought you'd want to know." Alicia looked down at the folder. She didn't answer right away. A part of her wanted to say no. She didn't want to relive the past or reopen old feelings. But another part of her, the part that had stood at that podium and spoken about change, knew that this might be a chance to make a real difference. After a long pause, she said quietly, "I'll take it." That afternoon, she drove across town to meet with the community oversight team and members of the other department. The building looked ordinary, gray walls, glass doors, and a faded flag outside. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt a strange mix of nerves and determination. She was greeted by a woman from the oversight board who smiled warmly. "Detective Carter, thank you for coming. We really appreciate your help with this." "It's not a problem," Alicia said politely. Inside the meeting room, a small group of people sat around a table. Two were department representatives. One was a community advocate, and another was a young officer who looked nervous just to be there. Alicia took a seat. The room fell quiet for a moment. One of the department officials cleared his throat. "I think we should start by saying we all know about the incident that brought this review into focus," he said, glancing briefly at Alicia. "We regret how that situation was handled, and we're here to ensure it doesn't happen again." Alicia nodded but stayed silent, letting him continue. They began discussing new policy changes, better bias training, communication workshops, and new community programs. On paper, it all sounded good. But Alicia knew that real change required more than just meetings and paperwork. It needed empathy, humility, and a willingness to listen. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned forward slightly and said, "These are good steps, but training alone won't fix this. What matters is how officers see the people they serve. You can't train someone to care, but you can teach them to slow down, to ask instead of assume." The room was quiet again. The young officer nodded slightly, as if her words had struck something in him. As the meeting went on, Alicia noticed how some people avoided eye contact when the topic of bias came up. Others seemed defensive, eager to move on. It reminded her of how uncomfortable it can be for people to face their own mistakes. When the meeting ended, one of the younger officers lingered behind. He approached Alicia as she gathered her notes. "Detective Carter," he said softly, "I wanted to say, I watched that video when it first came out. I felt embarrassed for what happened even though I wasn't there. My dad's an officer and he always told me to treat everyone the same. But I realized I don't always do that. I just wanted you to know I'm learning. Alicia smiled gently. That's all any of us can do, she said. Learn and do better next time. When she left the building, the sun was setting. The golden light stretched across the parking lot, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She couldn't change what had happened, but maybe she could help prevent it from happening to someone else. Over the next few months, Alicia continued to work with the Oversight Committee. She attended training sessions, gave talks to new recruits, and shared her story in a professional way that helped others understand how quickly assumptions could turn into mistakes. Each time she spoke, people listened. Some nodded in agreement, some looked uncomfortable, but everyone paid attention, and little by little she began to see progress. The 2 officers who had arrested her were required to attend every session. At first, she hadn't wanted to face them again, but eventually she agreed. She believed in giving people the chance to grow. When they finally met again, the room was silent. Both men looked uneasy. They had clearly been through their own share of reflection. The taller officer, the one who had handcuffed her, looked down before saying quietly, "Detective Carter, I'm sorry. I've wanted to say that in person for a long time." Alicia nodded. "I received your letter," she said. He looked surprised. "You did?" "Yes," she said. "And I appreciated it." He swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I learned something important that day. I learned how much damage one assumption can do." Alicia took a deep breath. "The fact that you understand that means more than an apology," she said softly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." The second officer spoke up too. "I was the one who doubted your badge," he admitted. "It's been eating at me. I shouldn't have handled it that way." Alicia looked at both of them and said, "You can't change what happened, but you can change what happens next. Make sure that next time when you see someone, you see a person, not a problem." They nodded and the room stayed silent for a while. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real. Later that night, Alicia drove home feeling lighter than she had in months. The road was quiet, the air cool. She rolled down her window and let the breeze hit her face. For the first time, she felt like she had finally turned the pain of that day into something meaningful. But even as she found peace within herself, she couldn't ignore how many others might never get the same chance. There were so many stories like hers that never made the news. So many people who didn't have a badge to protect them when things went wrong. That thought stayed with her, whispering quietly in her mind. The next morning, she decided to write. She sat at her kitchen table, the same spot where she'd read that first message from her colleague, and began drafting an article. Not about her, but about understanding, patience, and accountability. She titled it, "What I Learned When I Was Mistaken for a Suspect." Her words were simple and honest. She wrote about what it felt like to be on both sides of the badge. She didn't use anger or blame. She used honesty. When she finished, she sent it to a local newspaper. A week later, it was published. The response surprised her. Letters, emails, and messages poured in, from officers, from citizens, even from people in other cities who said her story made them rethink how they see others. Some readers said they cried. Others said they felt hope. One message came from a young girl who wrote, "I want to be a police officer one day, just like you, because I want to change things too." That message made Alicia smile for days. A few months later, she was invited to speak at a police conference. It was a big event, hundreds of officers from across the state. She wasn't sure what to expect, but when she walked on stage and looked at all the faces in the audience, she felt calm. She spoke about that day in the mall, but she also spoke about the bigger picture, how understanding others could make a difference in every encounter, how listening could prevent pain. She didn't point fingers. She didn't raise her voice. She just told the truth. When she finished, the audience stood and applauded. Some wiped their eyes. For a few seconds, Alicia just stood there, humbled. She hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything. She just wanted to tell her story. But now her story was helping others see the human side of law enforcement and the human side of the people they served. After the conference, as she stepped outside into the evening air, a gentle rain began to fall. She pulled her coat tighter and smiled to herself. The world was far from perfect, but she had done her part. That night, she sat by her window watching the rain slide down the glass. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Captain Reeves. It read, "You did good today. Proud of you. Alicia smiled softly and typed back, "Thank you, Captain." Then she put her phone down, leaned back in her chair and let herself finally rest. In the quiet of that moment, she realized something important. What had started as humiliation had turned into growth, not just for her but for others too. She had taken something painful and turned it into purpose. The world might move on, but she knew the lessons she'd helped plant would stay with the people who heard her story. She wasn't just Detective Carter anymore. She was a reminder that strength doesn't come from power. It comes from patience, from compassion, from courage to face truth even when it hurts. And as she drifted into sleep, she thought about her niece again, that bright little girl who once said her aunt was brave. For the first time, Alicia allowed herself to believe it might be true. Months passed since Alicia's speech at the police conference, but her words still lingered in people's minds. Officers from different departments had reached out to her for advice or guidance. Some wanted to share their experiences. Others just wanted to listen. It seemed like her story had become a quiet symbol of change, even if she never intended it that way. Life began to settle into a slower rhythm again. Alicia returned to her regular cases, spending long days at the precinct and even longer nights writing reports. Her days were filled with paperwork, meetings, and calls. To the outside world, she looked like she had completely moved on, but inside, she knew that part of her would always carry the memory of that afternoon in the store. Still, she refused to let that memory define her. Instead, she wanted it to shape how she helped others. One Friday afternoon, she received a call from the community outreach office. They asked if she would be willing to take part in a new mentorship program for young recruits and a chance to help new officers understand the importance of empathy and communication before they hit the streets. She agreed without hesitation. The first session took place at the training center, where 20 new recruits sat in a circle. They looked nervous and eager, the way all new officers do when they start. Alicia stood in front of them, hands in her pockets, calm and confident. "When I first joined the force," she began, "I thought this job was about being strong and brave. And it isn't, but not in the way most people think. Strength isn't about shouting the loudest or acting the fastest. It's about staying calm when things don't go your way. It's about listening. It's about remembering that every person you meet has a story you don't know." The room was silent. Every pair of eyes was on her. She didn't mention her own story at first. She wanted to see how they responded to her words without knowing her background. Then halfway through, one of the recruits raised his hand and said, "Ma'am, you're the officer from that video, right?" There was a murmur in the room. Alicia smiled softly and nodded. "Yes," she said. "That was me." The recruits shifted uncomfortably. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked curious. Alicia continued, her tone steady but warm. "What happened to me could happen to anyone. Not because of the badge, but because of how quick we sometimes are to make assumptions. The 2 officers who arrested me weren't bad people. They were just caught in a moment where they forgot to see me as a person first." A young woman sitting in the front spoke up. "How did you forgive them?" Alicia paused for a moment, then said, "Forgiveness isn't easy, but I realized that holding on to anger only hurts you. What helped me was knowing that I could turn that experience into something that might help others. Like this." She looked around the room. "That's why you're all here. Because every decision you make out there matters. You can stop someone's pain or add to it. You can change someone's life, for better or worse, in just a few seconds." By the end of the session, several recruits came up to thank her personally. One of them said quietly, "I think I understand now why this job is more than just enforcing laws. It's about people." That night, as Alicia drove home, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She knew she couldn't change the entire system alone, but she could plant seeds in the minds of those who would shape the future. When she got home, she fed her dog, made a cup of tea, and sat on the couch with a soft sigh. The city lights flickered outside her window. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her mother. "Dinner on Sunday?" It read. Alicia smiled. "Wouldn't miss it," she replied. Sunday dinner had always been a family tradition. Her parents lived in the same small house where she grew up, and every Sunday, they gathered around the old oak table that had seen countless meals and conversations. That evening, her mother greeted her with a hug that lasted longer than usual. "You look tired," she said. "I'm okay," Alicia replied with a small smile. Her father was watching the news where a story about police reform flashed briefly. When Alicia walked in, he turned down the volume. "They're still talking about that article you wrote," he said. "You've been doing something good, kid." Alicia chuckled. "Trying to." They ate together, laughing about old stories, and for a while everything felt simple again. But later, when Alicia was helping her mother wash the dishes, her mother said softly, "I still think about that day. I still remember how scared I was when I saw that video. But I'm proud of how you handled it. Not many people could do what you did." Alicia looked at her mother and smiled faintly. "I just didn't want to live angry. I wanted to do something that meant something." Her mother nodded slowly. "You did." After dinner, Alicia sat outside on the porch for a while. The night was cool and quiet, filled with the sound of crickets and distant traffic. She thought about how life had taken such a strange turn, how something that once brought her shame had now become her greatest source of purpose. But she also knew the work wasn't done. Change didn't happen overnight, and there were still moments when she saw the same patterns repeating in other cities and stories. Every time she saw a new headline, she felt a familiar weight in her chest. She couldn't fix everything, but she could keep trying. A few weeks later, Alicia was invited to a panel discussion on community trust. It was hosted at a local college, and students, officers, and residents were invited to attend. When she arrived, the auditorium was full. She was one of several speakers, but as she waited for her turn, she listened carefully to what others said. Some spoke about policies, statistics, and reforms. But Alicia noticed something missing: the emotional side, the human part of it all. When it was finally her turn, she walked to the microphone and looked out at the crowd. "Most of what you've heard today is about systems and numbers," she began. "But behind every system there are people. People trying to do the right thing, people making mistakes, people trying to heal from those mistakes." She paused and let her gaze move across the audience. "I was mistaken for a suspect once. I was humiliated, handcuffed, and judged. But I was also an officer. And that moment changed how I see the world. I learned that empathy can't just be a word we use. It has to be something we practice." A student raised her hand and asked, "Do you think things are actually getting better?" Alicia thought about it before answering. Slowly, she said, "Progress isn't loud. It doesn't happen in one big moment. It happens quietly, in conversations like this, in the way one person decides to act differently next time. It happens when someone stops to listen instead of assuming." When the event ended, people came up to her with questions, gratitude, and sometimes tears. A man in his 60s told her, "My son's an officer. I hope he listens to people the way you do." That night, as Alicia walked to her car, she looked up at the night sky. It was clear and full of stars, something rare in the city. For a brief moment, she felt like the world was finally starting to heal, one person at a time. But change has its challenges, and Alicia knew that too well. One morning, she arrived at work to find a stack of letters on her desk. Some were thank yous, others were harsh criticisms. One letter, written anonymously, said, "You should stop making cops look bad." Alicia sighed as she read it. She wasn't angry, just tired. She knew not everyone would understand her intentions. Some would see her story as betrayal instead of inspiration. Later that day, Captain Reeves stopped by her desk. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, holding up the letter. "Just another critic," he smiled faintly. "If you're getting critics, that means you're making an impact." Alicia smiled back. That's one way to look at it. Despite the occasional pushback, her work continued to grow. She was invited to speak in different cities, meet community leaders, and help develop new training programs. Each time she stood in front of a new crowd, she remembered the fear and confusion she'd felt that day in the store, and how far she'd come since then. In one session, a young officer approached her afterward and said, "I used to think stories like yours were exaggerated, but after hearing you, I realize how easy it is to make assumptions without even knowing it. I'm going to remember that." Alicia thanked him, feeling that same quiet sense of purpose again. As the months passed, she started keeping a journal, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. Each night she wrote down one thing she'd learned, one thing that made her proud, and one thing she wanted to do better. It helped her stay grounded. In one entry she wrote, "Growth isn't about being perfect. It's about learning from the moments that almost broke you." Her journal became her way of reminding herself why she kept going. One evening, As she was writing, she received a call from one of the officers who had arrested her. His voice was calm, but she could hear sincerity. "Detective Carter," he said, "I wanted you to know that I've been promoted. I'm leading a new team now, and we're starting a community partnership project. I wouldn't have thought to do this if it weren't for you." Alicia smiled quietly. "That means a lot," she said. "I'm proud of you," he paused. "I still think about that day. But now I use it to remind my team to look, listen, and think before they act." "Then it wasn't all for nothing," she said softly. After the call ended, Alicia sat in silence for a long time, her heart full. The story that once brought her pain had now sparked a small ripple of change in someone else's world. And maybe that was the true meaning of healing. Not forgetting, but transforming the pain into something useful. That night, as she turned off her lamp, she whispered to herself, "We all make mistakes, but we can all do better." The city outside her window was quiet again. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed softly, a reminder of the world she served, and imperfect, complicated, but still worth believing in. Alicia closed her eyes and drifted to sleep, her mind at peace, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Time had a strange way of moving for Alicia. Some days felt slow and peaceful, while others reminded her how much the world could still change in the blink of an eye. Her life had quieted down again, but in a good way. She was back to her usual cases, teaching recruits, helping at the community center, and writing now and then when inspiration struck. Her article had been shared far beyond her city. She didn't seek fame or attention, but people continued to reach out. Officers, students, even everyday citizens who just wanted to say her story made them think differently. Each message reminded her that words could travel farther than she ever imagined. One afternoon, she sat in her car outside the precinct, watching people go in and out. The sun was high, and the sound of distant traffic filled the air. She was lost in thought when her partner, a calm and easygoing officer named Bennett, tapped on her window. "You daydreaming again?" he teased with a grin. Alicia smiled. "Just thinking." "About the old case?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, about how much has changed." He leaned on the car door. "You've changed a lot of things yourself. Don't act like you didn't." Alicia laughed softly. "Maybe a few things, but there's always more to do." Bennett nodded in agreement. "That's true. Hey, there's a community event downtown tonight. They're hosting a youth forum about trust and respect between officers and kids. You should come. They'd love to hear from you." Alicia hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "All right, I'll go." That evening, the community center buzzed with life. Dozens of teenagers filled the room, along with officers, teachers, and parents. Colorful posters lined the walls, each one carrying messages like, "Respect builds bridges," and "Listen before you judge." When Alicia arrived, she was greeted with warm smiles. The organizer introduced her to the crowd, saying, "We're honored to have Detective Carter with us tonight. Many of you know her story, and if you don't, you're about to hear from someone who understands both sides of the badge." Alicia stepped up to the microphone. The room quieted down immediately. She looked at the faces before her, curious, cautious, hopeful. "I've been where some of you are," she began. "I grew up right here in this city. My parents worked hard, taught me to be respectful, and told me I could be anything I wanted. But even when you do everything right, sometimes life doesn't see you the way you see yourself." The room was silent, every word soaking in. "I was stopped once while off duty," she continued. "I was wearing plain clothes, doing something as ordinary as shopping. But in a few seconds, I went from being seen as a customer to being treated like a criminal. It was one of the hardest moments of my life, not just because I was embarrassed, but because it showed me how quickly assumptions can hurt people." A young boy in the front raised his hand. "How did you stop being angry?" Alicia thought for a moment. "I didn't stop right away," she said honestly. "I let myself feel angry first, and because anger is real. But I didn't stay there. I decided to use it for something better. I wanted to turn it into understanding, not bitterness." A girl in the back asked, "Were you scared to go back to work after that?" Alicia smiled faintly. "Yes, I was. But I reminded myself that I joined this job to make a difference. And if I quit, then that moment would have beaten me. So I kept going. And every day since, I've tried to make sure no one else has to feel what I felt that day. There was a soft murmur in the crowd. Some of the young people nodded quietly. Others wiped their eyes. After the talk ended, several of them came up to thank her. One boy said, "My brother doesn't trust the police anymore. But after hearing you, I think maybe some of them really do care." Alicia smiled gently and said, "There are a lot of good people out there trying to do the right thing. We just have to keep reminding each other that we're all human." When she left the community center, the air was cool and still. The city lights shimmered in puddles from a light rain earlier that evening. As she walked to her car, she felt a quiet warmth inside. The kind that comes when you know your story has touched someone's heart. The next few months passed peacefully. Alicia continued her work, balancing investigations with community projects. Her days were full but fulfilling. Every time she trained a new group of recruits or spoke to a group of students, she reminded them to see people, not stereotypes. But one morning, as she was leaving the precinct, Captain Reeves called her into his office. "Got something for you," he said, handing her a thick envelope. "What's this?" she asked. He smiled. "An invitation. They're hosting a national law enforcement leadership summit next month. They want you to be one of the keynote speakers." Alicia's eyebrows lifted. "Me?" "Yeah, you," Reeves said with a small grin. "You've been making waves, Carter. They want you to talk about your experience and how departments can rebuild trust. I think you should do it." Alicia looked at the envelope, then back at him. "That's a big stage. That's why you belong on it," he said simply. After a moment, she nodded. "All right, I'll do it." When the day of the summit came, Alicia stood backstage in a large conference hall filled with hundreds of officers, leaders, and advocates from across the country. Her heart beat faster than usual. She had spoken in many places before, but this felt different. Bigger, heavier, more important. As she walked to the podium, the crowd fell silent. Cameras flashed, lights gleamed, and she could see faces from every corner of the room. Men and women of all ranks, all waiting to hear what she had to say. She took a breath, steadied herself, and began. "I used to think leadership was about rank," she said, "about how many years you've served or how many cases you've solved. But I learned that real leadership isn't about authority. It's about empathy. It's about admitting when something is wrong and being brave enough to change it." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "Several years ago, I was handcuffed in public, not by criminals but by officers. I was mistaken for someone I wasn't. That moment could have destroyed me, but instead it became the reason I kept going. Because I realized that change doesn't start with rules, it starts with people. It starts with how we see each other." The room was utterly still. "I'm not here to shame anyone or point fingers," she continued. "I'm here to remind us all that we wear these badges not to separate ourselves from the people, but to serve them. Every time we forget that, we lose a little piece of what this uniform stands for." Alicia's voice softened. "If I could tell every officer one thing, it would be this. And slow down, listen. Ask questions before you assume. And remember that the person standing in front of you could be your neighbor, your friend, your sister, or even another officer." By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Some stood, clapping with emotion, while others simply nodded in deep respect. Afterward, several leaders approached her, thanking her for her honesty and courage. One older chief said, "I've been in this field for 30 years. I've heard a lot of speeches, but that one will stay with me." Alicia thanked him humbly, feeling both proud and deeply moved. When she finally left the stage, she stepped outside into the afternoon sun. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. For years, she had carried the memory of that day like a scar, but now standing here, she realized it wasn't a scar anymore. It was a lesson. A few weeks later, the video of her speech went viral. It spread across social media, reaching millions of viewers. People shared it not just because it was inspiring, but because it was human. She received messages from across the country, from parents, teachers, officers, and even young kids. One message said, "You made me believe that change is possible." Another said, "Your story made me want to join the force, to be the kind of officer the world needs." Each message touched her deeply. As time went on, Alicia began to see her story differently. It wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about what she did after. It was about how she turned pain into progress, how she reminded people that understanding was stronger than anger. One quiet evening, Alicia sat by her window again, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Her dog rested beside her, head on her knee. She thought about everything: the confusion, the fear, the anger, the growth. Her phone buzzed with a message from the same young officer she'd mentored months ago. It read, "I handled my first big call today. It went well. I remembered what you said, to slow down and listen. It made all the difference." Alicia smiled. She typed back, "Proud of you. Keep leading with heart." Then she set her phone down, leaning back as the sounds of the city drifted through the window. Sirens in the distance, laughter from a nearby street, the hum of traffic. It was the sound of life, messy but beautiful. In that quiet moment, Alicia realized something profound. The story that once brought her pain had become something much greater, a story of forgiveness, courage, and hope. A story that reminded others to see the humanity in one another. She knew she couldn't fix the whole world. But she also knew that change didn't start with the whole world. It started with one person, one act, one moment of understanding. She looked at her badge on the table, the same badge she'd worn the day everything changed. For a long time, she had seen it as a symbol of both pride and pain. Now she saw it as something else entirely, a reminder of what she stood for. Not power, not control, but compassion. As the night deepened, Alicia whispered softly to herself, "This is what it means to serve." She turned off the light, feeling calm, content, and quietly proud. And though her story had started with misunderstanding, it ended with something far more powerful: understanding. The next morning, as she headed out for another day of work, she smiled at the sunrise spreading across the horizon. It wasn't a new beginning exactly, but it was something close, a continuation of everything she'd fought to become. Because sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones who shout the loudest or fight the hardest. They're the ones who choose to forgive, to grow, and to keep believing in a better world, even after they've seen its worst. And Alicia, in her quiet strength, had become exactly that kind of person. Months passed, and the world seemed to move faster than ever. Alicia's story had traveled far beyond her city, inspiring conversations in places she had never even been. It wasn't something she had planned or expected, but people saw hope in her journey, hope that change could come from pain, and that understanding could grow out of mistakes. Life, however, had settled back into its steady rhythm. The fame had faded, and Alicia liked it that way. She didn't crave attention. She craved purpose. Each morning she still put on her badge, checked her notes, and went out to serve. The difference now was that every time she looked in the mirror, she saw not just a police officer, but a survivor, someone who had turned her hardest day into her greatest reason to keep going. One crisp morning, Alicia was assigned to a new community project. The department was launching a youth leadership program for teens interested in law enforcement and public service. It was designed not just to teach them about policing, but to bridge the gap between young people and the officers who served their neighborhoods. When Alicia heard about it, she immediately volunteered to help. She knew what it was like to be misunderstood, to feel unseen. Maybe she could make sure these kids never felt that way. The program's first day was held at a local recreation center. The gym buzzed with chatter and laughter as about 30 teenagers filled the bleachers, curious but skeptical. Alicia walked in wearing her uniform, but her expression was warm and calm. "Good morning, everyone," she said with a small smile. "I'm Detective Carter. Some of you might know me, some of you might not. But by the end of this program, I hope you'll see me as more than just a uniform." A few of the teens exchanged glances, their faces half curious, half cautious. Alicia continued, "This isn't a class where I talk and you listen. This is a conversation. I want to hear your stories too. Your questions, your fears, your ideas. We can only build trust if we understand each other." That first day was slow. The kids were polite but guarded. They weren't sure what to expect. But by the second week, things began to change. Alicia shared stories, not the kind you find in reports, but the human ones. She told them about the time she got lost on her first day on patrol, about the moments she doubted herself, and yes, even about the day she was mistaken for a suspect. When she told that story, the room fell silent. A girl sitting in the front asked softly, "You mean they really thought you were a thief?" Alicia nodded. "They did, and for a few minutes they didn't see me. They saw a stereotype. It hurt. But that moment taught me something important. It taught me that change doesn't start from anger. It starts from understanding. The girl looked down, her voice barely a whisper. My brother got stopped once for no reason. He still talks about it. Alicia's eyes softened. That's why I'm here. Because your brother's story matters too. And if I can help even one officer understand what that feels like, then maybe we can start fixing it. From that day on, the kids opened up more. They talked about their experiences, their dreams, and their fears. Some wanted to become police officers. Others just wanted to make their communities safer. Alicia listened to all of them with patience and empathy. As the weeks went by, the program became something special. Officers who once doubted the idea started attending too, just to watch the connection that was forming. One afternoon, during a workshop, a young boy named Darius raised his hand. Detective Carter, he said, if you could change one thing about how officers and people treat each other, what would it be? Alicia smiled thoughtfully. I'd make sure everyone, officers and civilians, remembers that the person in front of them is human. That's all. Not a threat, not a label, not a job. Just a person. The boy nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. By the end of the program's first month, Alicia noticed something beautiful. The kids had started greeting officers around the building with smiles instead of distance. They were asking questions, showing curiosity, and some officers who had been skeptical at first were now volunteering to mentor the teens. One day after class, one of the senior officers, Lopez, approached her. You've done something I didn't think was possible, he said. You got them to trust us, Alicia smiled. They didn't trust the badge. They trusted the people wearing it. Once they saw we were listening. Lopez nodded slowly. Maybe that's where we all need to start. As the program grew, Alicia was invited to share her methods with other departments. She didn't see herself as a leader, just as someone trying to make things better. But more and more people began looking to her for guidance. Still, she remained humble. Every time someone thanked her, she'd just say, I'm learning too. One afternoon, after a long day of mentoring, Alicia sat in her office finishing reports when a knock came at the door. It was a teenage boy from the program, one who had been quiet most of the time. Hey, she said with a smile. What's up? He hesitated before speaking. I just wanted to say, thank you. For what? She asked. For listening, he said simply. Most adults don't. Alicia smiled warmly. You're welcome. You deserve to be heard. He nodded and added, I used to think all cops were bad. But you changed that. You made me want to be one too. But a good one. Alicia's heart softened. Then you'll already be ahead of most. Just remember, being a good one isn't about being perfect. It's about caring. After he left, Alicia sat for a long time in silence. It struck her how something as simple as listening could change a person's view, maybe even their life. That night, as she drove home, the city glowed with the soft light of street lamps. The world looked calmer somehow. For the first time in a long time, Alicia felt not just proud of her work, but at peace with her past. Weeks later, the youth program held its final event, a graduation ceremony. Parents, community leaders, and officers gathered in the same gym where it all began. The room was full of laughter, excitement, and hope. When Alicia stepped up to the stage, she looked at the faces of the kids she had come to know so well. You all have taught me just as much as I've taught you, she said. You've reminded me why I chose this path in the first place, not to enforce laws but to build trust. You've shown me that the next generation is brave, smart, and full of heart, and I believe you'll be the ones to keep this city moving forward. The crowd clapped loudly. Parents cheered. A few kids wiped tears from their eyes. When the ceremony ended, one of the city officials approached Alicia. Detective Carter, he said, we're thinking about expanding this program, maybe even naming it after you. Alicia shook her head immediately, smiling. That's kind, but it's not about me. Name it after what it stands for, trust or unity or hope. That's what matters, he nodded. You really mean that, don't you? I do, she said softly. It was never about me. Later that evening, Alicia drove to a small park near her home. It was quiet, just the sound of wind in the trees and the faint laughter of children in the distance. She sat on a bench, letting the calm wash over her. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from her niece. It said, Auntie, my teacher showed us your video in class today. Everyone said you're amazing, Alicia smiled and typed back. Tell them I'm just doing my job. But deep down she knew it was more than that. The years had changed her. The pain of that one humiliating moment had transformed into something powerful, something that touched lives far beyond her own. What once felt like the worst day of her life had become the beginning of her purpose. A few days later, she was invited to speak at a local high school. Standing in front of hundreds of students, she shared her journey once again. But this time she noticed something different. When she finished speaking, the students didn't just applaud. They lined up to talk to her, to ask questions, to tell her their stories. Alicia realized then that storytelling was one of the most powerful tools she had. Not her badge, not her title, her story. Because stories connect people in ways rules and policies never could. That night she began writing again. This time not an article but a book. Not for fame or recognition but to leave something lasting. A message for future generations about patience, empathy, and courage. She wrote late into the night, her words simple but full of truth. She wrote about fear, forgiveness, and the quiet power of change. Weeks later, when she finished the final page, she sat back and smiled. The title read, Seen. It wasn't about her being seen. It was about seeing others. Months after its release, the book became quietly popular, especially among schools and training academies. People said it gave them perspective, that it made them think differently about how they treated one another. Alicia never bragged about it. She didn't need to. Knowing it was helping people was enough. One evening, as she left a bookstore where her book was displayed, she overheard a young woman say to her friend, "That's the detective who changed everything." Alicia smiled to herself and kept walking. That night, as she sat at home watching the city skyline, she thought about the long path she had taken, from that one painful misunderstanding to this quiet moment of peace. She had forgiven, grown, and inspired others to do the same. And though she knew the world still had a long way to go, she also knew that change had to start somewhere. And sometimes, it starts with just one person, one story, one decision to see with heart instead of judgment. Alicia looked at her badge resting on the table once more. It didn't shine as brightly as it used to, but that was okay. To her, its meaning had deepened. It wasn't just a symbol of duty. It was a symbol of compassion, resilience, and hope. As she turned off the light and got ready for bed, she whispered softly, "We're all still learning." Outside, the city lights shimmered, full of life and possibility, and as Alicia drifted to sleep, she knew her journey wasn't over. It had simply evolved into something greater than herself. Her story, once born from misunderstanding, had become a story of unity. And through every person it touched, it continued to live on, reminding the world that understanding isn't just something we talk about. It's something we do.